So we are walking through this series called Distinctions, and the idea is that we see God's created order under attack, and we see it in reverse order. So I want you to notice that as we go through. I want you to notice that when we started a couple of weeks ago, we started in Genesis 3, and now we're working our way back. Tonight we're going to be in Genesis 2. So last session we were talking about the role of husbands and wives, and we had to get into Genesis 3 and see some of that. Some of that's given in Genesis 2, but some of it's given in Genesis 3. As we back up a little bit tonight and talk not so much about husbands and wives, but as we talk about marriage and singleness, that there is a distinction between being married and being single, and God put that in His created order. That marriage is a distinct way of existing that is separate from singleness, that we have to back up to Genesis 2. Now, as we talk in next session about the identity and the roles of men and women, not husbands and wives, but men and women in general, we'll back up even further into Genesis 2, and eventually we'll back all the way up to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we'll notice that the foundational distinction that's being attacked is the distinction between God, the Creator, and His creation. So I want you to see that in our culture, and part of the reason I want you to see this is I want you to see that God's Word is true. I want you to see that something written 3,500 years ago by a man named Moses works its way out in such a way that you can't attack God's created order without starting at the top and working your way down. God has so designed creation that the order is so strong there that if you're going to get to something like the LGBTQ movement, or if you're going to get to something like we're seeing now where there's a blurring of the lines between humans and animals, if we're going to get there, we cannot start there. You can't. It's like the outer defenses has to be attacked first. Well, God lays out the order of creation, and He lays them out brick by brick, building up to the pinnacle, which is marriage between a godly husband and a godly wife. And so if you're going to attack those foundational lower levels or more inner levels of defense, you got to attack the outer ones first. So I want this to build confidence for you in God's Word. And as we've said all along, God's created order is in no danger of being undermined or thwarted. What will happen is not that God's created order will be destroyed, it's that our culture will be destroyed. When we stop recognizing God's created order, our culture won't stand. So many people, what they want in our culture is they want all the benefits that come from Western society. The prosperity, the stability, the security, the democracy, and the idea of representative government and a government for the people, by the people. They want those things, but they want to remove the foundational worldview that led to those things. It took hundreds of years for the Western worldview to create what we enjoy today. And it was not perfect in any way, and the process was far from perfect. The process was very ugly, but it was founded on Christian ideas and Christian principles, not just in America, but going all the way back to Western European culture and how these ideas were built upon, those theological ideas. Took hundreds of years to develop what we enjoy today, the prosperity, security, protection, relative lives of relative ease that we enjoy today, and lives of fulfillment, lives where we get to pursue what it is we want to be. I mean, you think about that. That's kind of the American thing, right? If you have a dream, go out and do it. If you want to try something, go out and try it. Well, for most people throughout most of history, it wasn't that way. You really didn't get to choose what you got to do. You just kind of did what you had to do in order to survive. So all those benefits, even the thoughts of tolerance and freedom of speech and freedom of religion, that we're not going to force anybody to worship the way we worship, those things took centuries to develop, and they developed on the foundation of a Christian worldview. Baptists were one of the biggest proponents for freedom of religion. And one of the reasons we're big proponents of freedom of religion is we believe that a forced conversion is a false conversion. So if we make somebody convert to Christianity, they're not really Christians. So what we want to do is persuade people to convert to Christianity. That's the only real chance of a genuine conversion. So it's evangelistic for us, that they should be able to pursue truth in a way where they're not forced into a system of ideas or forced into a religion, and then we persuade them to come, because then that's not a forced conversion. And we don't believe that a forced conversion is a real conversion. So all that's developed on this solid theological worldview. What people want to do today is they want to keep all the benefits, but they want to rip out the foundation. Well, that is like saying, I love my house. It is a great house, but I really hate the foundation. So what we're going to do is rip out the foundation of our house, but we'll keep living here. Well, it's not going to work. The house is going to crumble. So those foundational ideas that are there, that we're talking about as we see these attacks on God's created order, they won't lead to the destruction of God's created order. That's written too well into the fabric of creation. It will lead to the destruction of our culture. That's what we're really looking at. That's what we're really going to see in years to come. So we've talked about the role of husband and wife. Tonight we're going to talk about the role of marriage and singleness, or the distinction of marriage and singleness. Next session we'll talk about the distinction between the role of men and the role of women, more general in society, kind of outside of marriage. Then we'll talk about the distinction between the identity of men and the identity of women. Then the distinction between humans and other creatures, and the distinction between creatures, those that have the breath of life, and the rest of creation. And then we'll again point to that idea that ultimately this is an attack on the distinction between God the Creator and His creation as laid out for us in Romans chapter 1. And in next session we'll dive into Romans chapter 1, and we'll see that kind of what we've been seeing in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, what we've seen built up. Romans 1 shows us how the attack comes, and how it kind of shows us that reverse order when a society turns its back on God. But tonight we're going to focus on this distinction between marriage and singleness. So Genesis 2, 24 through 25, if you have your Bibles, put your eyes on that text. If not, you can listen closely as I read it. It says this is God's statement, or Scripture's statement that takes place. We're not sure who said it. We're not sure if this came from Adam. Adam might have said it, or it might be something that God put in as commentary on this, but either way, it's God's Word. It says this: "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." This is that great statement about marriage. A man is going to leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, hold fast to his wife. In the King James, he's going to leave and he's going to cleave. Lindsay and I, when we're doing premarital counseling, if you don't leave, you can't cleave. And so that idea that man and woman are going to come together and they're going to form, the two are going to become one flesh, and then the man and his wife, representative of all marriages as they were intended to be. Now keep in mind, there's only ever been one marriage that was marriage as it's intended to be, and that's the marriage we just read about. And that marriage didn't even last that long as it was intended to be. Just a few verses later, we're going to see that marriage undone. So Adam and Eve had marriage as it was intended to be, but they only had it for a short time. Then after that, all of us experience some deviation off of what marriage was intended to be. But this is the ideal. The two were naked and they felt no shame. So we have perfect intimacy, and we'll unpack that here in just a moment. But what I want us to see in our time together tonight is this: God established marriage for His glory and our good, and when we blur the lines between marriage and singleness, we destroy the path to life and fulfillment. So we make a grave error when we start saying, marriage is not really that big of a deal. Why do we need marriage? By the way, that comes from my generation. So last time we talked about the role of husband and the role of wife. That debate, as far as a culture-wide debate, happened before me. Before my generation came along, at least before I was into adulthood, the culture had already settled on the fact that we don't really need distinct roles between husband and wife. Now, those roles still persist, and it aggravates the culture. There's a report on it at least once a year that family duties are still broken down among gender roles. And it's a negative report. It comes out every year. I read it somewhere. Somebody does that study and bemoans the fact that women are still acting like women, men are still acting like men. So it persists, but the culture has rejected the idea that it should persist. And that happened before my time. But in my time, kind of the cutting edge of the cultural argument was, do we really need marriage? Marriage is a patriarchal institution. It's just designed for men to keep women under control. It's really not good for society. Do we really even need it anymore? What's the use of marriage? A lot of people that I kind of grew up with, went to school with college with, said, why do I need to get married? Why not just live together and be single? And then if it doesn't work out, then I don't have to go through all the legal processes of breaking that up, And so we're just going to, my generation was the test drive generation. We're going to test drive our relationship before we get married. So we're going to move in together and live together for a little while and kind of test things out before we commit to marriage. And of course, that persists in society. But what I want us to see is as we do that, as we make that turn as a culture and we blur those lines, both as individual couples, so this is couples who blur those lines, but also as a culture when we blur those lines, what we do is we destroy the path to life and fulfillment. Now, that's not to say that every couple who gets married is going to have great life and that's filled with joy. That's not what I'm saying. But this is the path God has designed. And the more we deviate from it, the more we deviate from the path God has laid out for life and fulfillment. So I want to talk about it in this way, starting with singleness and then marriage and then how we've blurred these lines. So let's start here. Singleness was designed for preparation and sanctification. I'm speaking here of singleness, meaning singleness before marriage, not lifelong singleness or a calling to singleness or singleness due to the death of a spouse. I'm talking about how it was designed to be. It was designed to be that a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. So this is before sin entered the world and made all those complications. So singleness was designed for preparation and sanctification. Preparation through living in a healthy family. How would a young man or young woman know what it's like to have a healthy family? Well, they would be raised in a healthy family. They would see a healthy family be modeled, and then they would grow up and be a husband or wife in a family that is healthy because they've seen that healthy family modeled. So there's preparation through living in a healthy family. I think that's straightforward enough. But then there's also sanctification. Would there have been sanctification if there were no sin? Or what is sanctification? Sanctification is the process of making us more holy, making us more into who God wants us to be. Well, I would argue that yes, even had sin never entered the world, there would still be sanctification. And I base it off this fact. I base it off the fact that the New Testament tells us that Jesus grew in wisdom and knowledge and favor with God and man. The book of Hebrews says that He was perfected through suffering. In other words, Jesus wasn't sinful, but Jesus was still, as a human, the humanity of Jesus was still growing in the fact that He had opportunities laid out ahead of Him to be obedient to the Lord. And every time He took advantage of one of those opportunities, then He grew in who God wanted Him to be. So I believe there would have still been sanctification. What would that sanctification look like in singleness? Well, let's ask this question. What was Adam doing when he was single? Think about it. Adam was in the garden. Adam was naming the animals. Adam was taking care of the garden. Adam was walking with the Lord. Adam had God's Word. Now, wouldn't you like to be Adam? Adam could memorize the entire Bible, all of God's Word, in one command. You shall not eat of the tree that is in the middle of the garden. That's all Adam had to memorize, and he could say, hey, I've memorized the whole Bible. But he still had God's Word. So what was Adam doing? Well, he was building a relationship with God. He walked with God in the garden. He had a relationship. He was learning God's Word, so God was teaching him. Here's not just the command, you shall not eat from the tree that I commanded you, but He was teaching him, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Here's what I want you to do. He was learning discipline. He was learning discipline because there was something there he was supposed to avoid. So God put something in the garden and says, stay away from it. Every day he walks by this tree, and every time he sees it, he says, I'm to avoid that. Well, that takes discipline, so he's learning discipline. And then he was serving the Lord, as I've already mentioned, in tending the garden, and then eventually in naming the animals. You know, as you read that story and you realize, I think maybe as a kid you read it, you don't get what's going on. But as an adult, it's pretty clear. If you read Genesis chapter 2, you realize the reason that God had Adam name the animals is He wanted Adam to realize there was no helper suited for him. There was a purpose in it. It wasn't that God said, my goodness, all these animals, how am I ever going to get them named? You know, Adam, why don't you do something down there? Get to naming animals. No, God had a purpose for Adam to name those animals. So as Adam is classifying and naming animals, and as he's giving names and maybe even complex classifications to animals, maybe he's even saying these kinds go with those kinds, and we really don't know what that looked like, but he notices something. He notices there's not a match for him. Nothing's really like him. There's nothing of his kind. And so it's a sanctifying process. God helping him see what God already knew. It is not good for the man to be alone. So there's a sanctifying process in all of this. So God gives us the gift of singleness to prepare us for marriage and family. There are things that God wants to do in our lives to prepare us for marriage and family that He can do best as we're single. So in premarital counseling and even in marriage counseling sometimes, I'll tell couples, if you come into marriage needing something from your wife, or if you come into marriage needing something from your husband, you're setting yourself up for failure. You need to be complete in Christ and then come into a marriage. And if you don't, then you're going to try to pull out of your husband or wife what they can't really give you. You're going to try to pull something out of them that only Jesus can give you. So part of that single process, even for us now, is developing and putting our roots deep into Jesus so that we're ready, we're marriable material. So I put a quote there for you from Tony Evans, who said one time in a sermon, "Ladies, I want you to notice what Adam had before he got married. Adam had a place to live and he had a job." So you can let that fall where you want to. It's a good point. Adam was ready by the time God said, "I want to bring this woman to you." But now after the fall, things are even more complicated when it comes to singleness. Because now there's a different kind of singleness. Where before the fall, singleness was really intended to be a short amount of time. You would be living at home with your parents, preparing, then you would leave and you would form a new family with your new wife. But now there are different kinds of singleness. So there's singleness that comes along because of sin. There's singleness that comes along because of, someone may get married and then a divorce happens very early and here they are, they're single. Or because of death. That's another result of sin. God never intended for it to be that way. So someone gets married, their spouse dies, they are single again. But there's also a call to singleness. And I don't believe that call to singleness would ever have existed had it not been for sin and God's redemptive plan, God's need to redeem the world. But we do know there is a call to singleness. So Matthew chapter 19, verse 12 says this, "There are eunuchs who have been so from birth." Now a eunuch is just a man who is incapable of reproduction in marriage. So there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men. There are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive this. I'm so glad that Jesus put that last phrase in there, because when I read it, I clearly knew I was not one who was able to receive it. I am not one who's able to receive this idea of becoming a eunuch, or what we would say is being single for the kingdom of heaven. That there's a calling to singleness. So there's a calling to say, I'm going to focus my mind and heart and attention on the kingdom of God. Paul echoes this idea in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He goes into quite some detail, and he talks about the idea that if you get married, and if you're a man, now you're worried about the needs of the kingdom, but you're also worried about the needs of the world, how to take care of your wife. If you get married and you're a woman, now you're worried about not only the needs of the kingdom, but also the needs of the world, mainly the needs of your husband. So you're torn. And Paul says, I just wish that some of you would see the benefit of actually living as a single person for the kingdom. And he says, if you're able to accept it and you're able to live that way, you can actually live a very productive life for the kingdom in singleness. But he also goes out of his way to say, it is not a sin to get married, and if you want to get married, get married. It's okay, get married. But if you feel a call to singleness, then pursue that call to singleness. So there's the singleness that God designed in His original created order. There's a singleness now that comes along because of sin that's entered the world. And then there's even this singleness that comes along because in a fallen world, we will be distracted by things of the world, and we won't pursue the kingdom as we would if we were single. So that's now a calling. In much the same way that there is a calling to share the gospel now. There really wouldn't have been a calling to call sinners to repentance had the fall not taken place. But now we have that calling. Well, now in the same way, we have a call to singleness. But before sin entered the world, God's design for everyone was marriage. And even now, God's plan for most people is marriage. So yes, singleness is designed for preparation and sanctification, and you can still be highly sanctified. If you're a lifelong single, or you're a single again, or you've just decided God's kind of called you to that, I will say this. Sometimes people have asked me, how do I know God's called me to singleness? The number one way you can know God's called you to singleness is if you are single. So if you're single, then God has called you in this moment to live faithfully as a single person in pursuit of His kingdom. That call to singleness might change for you. You might say, I don't want to be called to be single. Then the Scripture says, that's okay, pursue marriage, that's fine. Pursue marriage as long as it's in the Lord and as long as it's according to the design that God has laid out. So there's nothing wrong with pursuing marriage. But if you happen to be single in this moment, then see and understand God has called you to pursue His kingdom in singleness, and that right now, even if it's just for a few months or a few years, you have a way that you can pursue God's kingdom that you would not be able to if you were married. So pursue it in that way and take advantage of that opportunity. But for most of us, God's plan for us is not a calling to lifelong singleness, but it is a calling to lifelong commitment through marriage. So marriage was designed to be a lifelong commitment and the deepest human intimacy. A lifelong commitment. We, of course, know Scripture teaches a lifelong marriage, but I want you to see how Jesus talks about lifelong marriage. So in Mark chapter 10, the Pharisees come to Him and they're putting a test to Him. And they ask this question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? So Jesus asks them a question. One thing you notice about Jesus is He almost always answers a question with another question. So Jesus asked the question, what did Moses command you? They said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. And Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, He wrote this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So He quotes from Genesis. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two become one flesh. So then Jesus gives His commentary. They are no longer two, but one flesh. I want you to notice what happens here. They come to Jesus and say, is it okay for a man to divorce his wife? Now this was a hot button topic in the first century. There were many people who taught that you could divorce your wife just because you thought she wasn't pretty anymore. You think she's not pretty anymore, and you can write her a certificate of divorce. In fact, there were some commentators on the Old Testament Scriptures in the first century and around the first century who had said, it's clear that Moses says it's okay. If she's not pretty enough, if she doesn't cook your dinner the right way, you just write her a certificate of divorce and send her on her way, and then you go marry somebody else that you want to marry. So they come to Jesus and they say, is this right? And Jesus says, well, what does Moses say? And they quote this verse, and Jesus says, Moses gave that to you because of the hardness of your hearts. But from the beginning, He goes back to the beginning, it was not supposed to be this way. I want you to hear what Jesus is saying. Yes, divorce exists, but it was never God's intention, and it's not part of God's created order. So even divorce, even in times where divorce is the only option, divorce, there are clearly biblical reasons, you walk through all that, it's the only option, you pursue reconciliation, all that stuff, you do all that stuff, even then, it's not the way God designed it to be, and you can't come out of it undamaged. And a society that pursues divorce and has a lot of divorce in it is not going to come out of that undamaged. Even though the person may be in the right for the divorce, and it might have been their only option, it still speaks to the overall damage that happens in society when we're not in line with God's created order. So Jesus goes back to the beginning, and then He makes this very strong statement. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So woe to the one who brings separation, even when divorce is necessary, even when divorce happens. You know, warning, let there be a warning to him who has separated what God never intended to be separated. So marriage was designed to be a lifelong commitment and the deepest human intimacy. And much like the law of Moses, there are laws on our books to deal with the fact and the truth of divorce. And there are even pastoral ethics where we have to deal with, well, divorce is a reality, now what are we going to do with it? But in the beginning, it was not intended to be that way. It was intended to be a lifelong commitment. It was also intended to be the deepest human intimacy possible. We're talking about so much more here than sex. We're talking about emotional intimacy, psychological intimacy. God designed marriage to be this unique place where two become one. And yes, that is speaking of sexual union. It's speaking of procreation, that two people produce one person. But it's also speaking of a miraculous thing that can take place. Doesn't always, but can take place in a marriage. Some of you see that older couple, that's that sweet older couple that we all want to be, that we say, well, they've been married for 85 years and they sit on the rocking chair and they just, finish each other's sentences. Or if you're a Frozen fan, they finish each other's sandwiches, if you've seen that. Maybe they do both. But you go, man, look at that. It's almost like they're the same person. Have you ever seen those couples that as they get older, they almost like they look alike? You're like, man, it's amazing the level of intimacy that you see in some couples. Now, there's no perfect intimacy, but marriage is the best chance we have on earth to experience that kind of intimacy, and God designed it to be that way. It's also, obviously, the only proper place for sexual activity. This is something that I share with young people, and I think it's something that we need to think through even as adults, that sex is like fire. We're watching in our nation right now, and really all over the world, fire is ravaging places all over the country and causing all kinds of issues. Fire is very dangerous, it's very destructive, but fire is also very beautiful. There's nothing that I like more than to have a fire in my fireplace at home. And a fireplace is the proper place for a fire. A forest is not the proper place for a fire. In fact, really, anything outside of that fireplace or fire pit or fire ring is not the proper place for fire. Well, in the same way, sex is a beautiful thing. Sex is a wonderful thing. It's God's gift to man, but it has its proper place. And marriage, lifelong commitment between a man and a woman, is the proper place for that. So God has given us sex to enjoy, and He's given us sex for other reasons. So what are God's reasons for sex? Well, Scripture makes it clear. Some of them, most of them here in Genesis. Genesis tells us that one of God's purposes for sex is procreation. Be fruitful and multiply. Genesis 1:28. God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So that's one reason that God has given us this. It's for think about this. It's for the reproduction of image bearers. Why would God want us to fill the earth? Is that just, man, I just like to see, I created this wonderful earth and it's kind of empty and I'd like to see it filled. But not just filled with anything, filled with image bearers of God who can worship Him and be in relationship with Him. So reproduction for a Christian is about the reproducing image bearers of God and then raising of godly offspring. So we fill the earth with godly image bearers who are worshiping the Lord and following the Lord. So it's for procreation. Now the Puritans thought that this was the only reason, and they taught that this was the only purpose for sex, that it was only for procreation. And they minimized any other aspect of it. But it's clear in Scripture that that's not the only reason. Another purpose that God gave us for sex is intimacy. So that phrase we read earlier, the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. What is intimacy? Intimacy is the removing of all barriers between you and another person. So we all have walls and barriers that are designed to protect us from other people. And the more you know someone, the less barriers you build up, the more you let somebody in. So I'll give you an example. If you're walking down the sidewalk and somebody walks up to you and says, hey, how you doing? Well, you've never spoken to this person in your life. They don't know your name, they don't know your address, they don't know who you are, they don't even know if you can speak yet. You got all your barriers up. And you have to make a decision. Am I going to speak to this person? You might choose not to speak to that person because you might think, what are they up to? It's a defense mechanism. If I speak to them, I'm lowering one of my defenses. Now that's a very low wall, so most of the time we go, I'm doing all right. But boy, we watch them. Why are they asking me that? What are they up to? What if they say, my name is Derek, what's your name? You got another decision to make. Am I going to remove that wall that protects me from them? So I see some no's in the room, like, no, they are not finding out my name, you know. Well, there are most people, I would say, well, my name's Derek, what's your name? But here's the thing. There are very few people in this world that I would say, yeah, my name's Derek, and by the way, my address is this, and if you want to know my bank account number, it's this, and my PIN number is this. There are some people in this room that I would give you my bank account number and PIN number if you ask for it. I'm not going to tell you which ones I would give it to and which ones I wouldn't give it to. But, you know, okay, you know, if there's a legitimate reason you need it. Now, my wife knows all of that. My wife knows every login I have. She knows every PIN number I have. She knows everything about all of that because I'm lowering walls. So every time you lower one of those walls, you increase intimacy. And then what marriage really is, Christian marriage, and rightly done, is the continual removing of walls so that you just grow in intimacy to one another and you have no reason to hide from each other. They were naked and they were not ashamed. They did not need to hide from each other. They were perfectly comfortable being completely exposed to one another. They had nothing to hide and they were not ashamed. Perfect intimacy. That's one of the reasons that God gave us the gift of sex. Also, God gave us the gift of sex for pleasure. It's not just for procreation. It is not just for intimacy, but it is for our pleasure and enjoyment. What is my scripture reference on that? The Song of Solomon. Just read it and recognize that God gave us sex for the gift of pleasure. And then after the fall, so that's all exists before the fall. That's all Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 3, there's another reason, there's another purpose that God gives for sex, and that is for protection from temptation. So Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The woman should give his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. Paul goes on to make one of the most incredible statements of equality you will find anywhere in ancient literature, and especially first century literature. He says, "For the wife's body does not belong to her." And there are people who will say, of course, that's that oppression of women by men. And then he says, "And the husband's body does not belong to him." So it is this mutual giving of each other's bodies where the wife actually owns the husband's body and the husband owns the wife's body. He says it doesn't belong to them alone, it belongs to the other as well. So it's this incredible statement of equality. You will not find a statement of equality like that anywhere in ancient literature. You won't find a statement of equality like that all the way through the 19th, 20th century, and it's even hard to find a statement of equality like that now. So we're always looking for equality, so I like to point out how much the Bible raises and elevates the rights of women. And so Paul says, hey, there's another reason. This protects you from sexual temptation. It is a protection from temptation. So we've got the idea of singleness, the idea of marriage, and then I want to spend some time thinking about how we've walked away from that, how we've kind of blurred the lines. So when we look for the characteristics of marriage in singleness, and that's what I mean we're doing here, we're saying that I want to get what God intended and designed marriage to be, but I want to get it without marriage. So I want to blur the lines between marriage and singleness. When we do that, we pervert God's design, we point away from His glory, and we work against our good. So we look at the LGBTQ movement and we say, this is a perversion of God's design. And it certainly is. But it is not the only perversion of God's design. So to look at the LGBTQ lifestyle and say, well, look at them, they're taking what God designed and they're perverting it into something it was not intended to be. Yes, that's true, but we also have to look at the way that we treat marriage and singleness, and we've done the very same thing. So we look at God's design and we see some ways that we've done that, some signs that we've done that. One of those signs is just sex outside of marriage. Sex outside of marriage is not a rarity anymore. In fact, those who do not have sex outside of marriage is a rarity now. So, and again, that was kind of my age. As I was growing up, I kind of saw the transition in that. To where now it's much of the sex education that we offer in our public schools and much of the thoughts that come from psychologists and counselors is, hey, this is just a normal part of being a teenager. This is just a normal part of being a young adult. We can't fight against it, and we shouldn't fight against it. It's actually detrimental to the health and the development of teenagers and young adults to tell them that they should wait until they're married to have sex. That's the world we live in. Well, that's a perversion of God's design. That's blurring the lines between singleness and marriage. Then there's also this, having and raising children outside of marriage. Now, I want to be real careful here because what I want to say is I know there are single moms that are raising children, and are you saying that they have somehow perverted God's created order? No. I'm saying that, and we would have to look into each individual situation to know. What I'm saying is that society and culture and the world in general is broken in such a way that such a thing as a single mom exists. A single mom ought not exist. In a Genesis 1 and 2 world, a single mom would not exist. So one of the signs that we have left God's created order, and one of the signs that God's created order is not what it ought to be, is that single moms, and of course also in some cases, single dads exist. So the question obviously comes to mind. I think it's a really good kind of practical way to think about this. If a teenage couple gets pregnant, should they get married? I've been asked that many times in my ministry. Well, this young lady got pregnant by her boyfriend. Should they get married? And my answer is always, I don't know. I have to talk to them. I have to find out what's going on here. What's going on in the dad's life? What's going on in the mom's life? It might be the right thing for them to get married. It might not be the right thing for them to get married. There's a lot to consider there. But that is a sign that God's created order is under attack, or that it's been violated in some way. I would say this though, regardless of whether mom and dad get married, number one, that dad has a responsibility to that kid to take care of that kid and recognize that he's a part of the family. And as that child grows up, even if mom goes on to marry somebody else, that father needs to in some way be a part of that child's life as it's appropriate, and importantly, as he matures as a man. And then also that child needs to, if at all possible, be raised in a family environment. Now that's not always possible. Again, we live in a Genesis 3 world, not a Genesis 2 world. But if at all possible, this young lady gets pregnant and it's just not right, the guy's just not, it would not be positive for this boy in any way, for this young child in any way, for her to get married to this boy. So the parents, the pastor, the church, they all pray together, they make the decision. Yeah, it's not a good decision here for them to get married. But then that doesn't mean that it's best for this child to just be raised by a single mom. What can we do to get her in a family environment? Can she stay at home with mom and dad so that this child has a healthy family to look at as it's modeled? Or how can we, and I've told several single moms this before, if you're a single mom and your mom and dad aren't necessarily good influences, and you don't have brothers or something like that, man, find some godly men who will, in appropriate ways, get involved, especially in your son's life, so that they can see an example of a godly man, because they need that. So as much as possible, that child needs to be raised in a family environment. Another way we see it in our culture is the devaluing of marriage and children. There is a massive move to devalue marriage overall, and then even having children. Now, this is not my generation. This is the generation after me. There was not a devaluing of children when I was coming up, but there was a devaluing of marriage. What's the big deal? We don't need to necessarily get married. We might even like to have kids one day, but we don't like to get married to have kids. That was kind of the thought, coming up when I was a teenager and a young adult. But now it is this: why do we even need to have kids? So I'll give you a couple of statistics. In the United States, pets outnumber children in apartment complexes. Did you know that? There are more pets than children in apartments. In Seattle, there are more households that have cats than have kids. And then you might have heard this one. In the city of San Francisco, these numbers are, I think, 2018, 2019. There were 150,000 dogs in the city limits of San Francisco, and 115,000 kids under 18 years old. So there are more dogs than kids in the city of San Francisco. So we have devalued marriage, we have devalued kids, and that is a sign that we're outside of God's created order. It's not supposed to be that way. Again, that doesn't mean that every couple is supposed to have kids, or every couple is supposed to have 5 kids like we're supposed to have. We realized years ago in this whole discussion of should we have other kids, there are some people who say you should have as many kids as possible. You should just have kids as many as you should. We've never believed that. We've never thought that. We've always said we need to have as many kids as we can handle and disciple. That's how many kids we need to have. And unfortunately, I don't think you'll know that until you have the one that you can't handle and disciple. And then at that point you go, well, maybe we had one too many, but we love him anyway and we're going to do our best. So, and then of course there are some issues that come along with age and that kind of thing. So there's no perfect number to a family, but we see it in general in the devaluing of kids and families. And so that's a big deal in our culture. And then I want you to notice, those are some signs. I want you to notice this. I've said this all along, that biology will not let us get away from God's created order. We see that in many areas, we also see it in this. Biology will not let us get away from this idea of marriage and family. Biology and unbiased scientific observation reinforce the truth claims of God's Word. What do I mean by that? On the physical side, to be straightforward, men and women have a desire to be with one another sexually. There's a desire there. They want to be with one another sexually. That's a biological truth. Well, that doesn't necessarily lead to marriage. I agree with that, but it does show us that God designed men and women to want to be with one another. God did design that. Also, sex leads to children. You go, well, okay, thank you. I mean, like we didn't know that. I want you to notice how hard we as a culture work to make sure that sex does not lead to children. So we have invented many, many ways to make sure that sex does not lead to children. Some of those are sinful ways, some of those are not, and it's debatable which of those are sinful and which are not, obviously. Some are obviously sinful, like abortion, but think about all the ways we go out of our way to make sure that sex does not lead to children. And so when we say that, it's obvious sex leads to children, notice how we're kind of fighting against that as a culture. And then sex is enjoyable. Sex is enjoyable, so sex leads to children. Men and women want to have sex with one another. So clearly God has designed something, and our biology betrays the fact that God said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. The two become one. There is a physical component to that. But then there's also an emotional and psychological component. Intimacy occurs, as we said earlier, when people take down the boundaries that separate them, when they stop hiding from each other. I want you to notice the very first thing, look back to your text, the very first thing that happened when Adam and Eve sinned. So in Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, the Bible, let me back up to verse 6 so you can see that it's the very first thing. The Bible says this, she, being Eve, took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. What is the very next phrase? The eyes of both of them were opened. They knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. The very first thing they did is they said, we got to separate from each other. The eyes are open. They realize, I'm at a level of intimacy that I do not want to be with this person, and now I need to separate myself from them. So when we see this idea of building walls that keep us from intimacy, we see this process taking place because of sin. And now I want you to think about this. Every barrier that you have is a barrier that's in place because of sin. So the reason you don't want the guy in the street to know your name and your bank account and your PIN number, the reason PIN numbers even exist is because of sin. The reason I don't want him to know where I live is because of sin. The reason that you come into a marriage and you might not share your deepest, darkest hurts and pains at first, the reason that takes a lifetime is because of sin. Everything that is in place emotionally and psychologically to keep us from intimacy is because of sin. It didn't exist in Genesis 2. We eat the fruit, bam, it's there. Now we're dealing with it all these years later. There's this idea that barriers to intimacy in unmarried couples. So let's think about that. We know that intimacy is, those barriers are there in married couples, but it's uniquely there in unmarried couples. So you say, hey, you know what? We don't need this marriage thing. Let's just skip the whole marriage thing. We love each other. Let's just, build a life together. Why do we need the marriage? Why do we need the piece of paper? Well, let me tell you what happens in unmarried couples who take that track. First of all, there's a lack of trust. And it can take years for this to manifest. I used to work with a guy, and I won't say his name, but good guy, good solid guy, and he was living with his girlfriend and lived with her for many years. And I was talking with him one day on the job, and he was telling me about a fight that he and his girlfriend had, and so we were talking about it, and he's trying to ask me, what should I do? I don't know what to do. She's mad at me. And I said, look, man, I'm just going to tell you something. I said, it comes down to one thing. She doesn't trust you. He said, what do you mean? I said, she doesn't trust you. She wants to know why you've been with her all these years and you've never married her. And I didn't know the lady. And he said, I'd never met her. And he said, that's not true. I said, ask her. All right, I will. He came back to work the next day. I asked her. I said, you did? Yeah. How'd that go? He said, well, you were right. I said, yeah, it's a question that comes to a woman's mind. Why have you been with me, lived in this house with me for 8 years? Why have we built a life together? But for some reason, you don't want to make this official. She doesn't trust you. She's afraid that you're waiting for a way out and you're keeping your options open, so she doesn't trust you. And I'm glad to report that I got to do their wedding. And I'll never forget when I had the conversation with him when they came to my office, and so we're talking through the wedding. I said, now you understand that this means that you two can't be together. You can't sleep together until the wedding. The look on his face was fantastic. I wish I had a picture of it. And he told me later, he's like, when you said that, I thought as soon as we got out of this office, I'm going to talk her out of that. And he said, but I got out of that office and I started trying to talk her out of it, and I found out she was with you. and so he said, it's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I said, well, good, man. You know what? It's also a very rewarding thing and a very loving thing that you can do for your wife. So it's a lack of trust and a lack of security. What is my life going to be like? My life could change at any moment because this person hasn't committed to me in a lifelong way. And so that question of why won't he marry me, and sometimes, let's be honest, why won't she marry me, comes up, and it works away at that trust issue and that security issue. Those are psychological and emotional realities that we cannot get away from because they are built in and baked into God's created order. One of the reasons that couples live together before marriage and they have higher divorce rates is because of this. That lack of trust, that lack of security. They move into marriage with a foundational issue of trust and security. It's never really resolved. The piece of paper doesn't do it because they've never really dealt with the root issues that are there. You know this phrase that kind of came up in my generation, I just want to test drive. You'd never buy a car without test driving a car. Well, what does test driving a car mean? Test driving a car means I may or may not like it. So I go down to the dealership and I see a car and I say, I'd like to test drive this car. I want to try it out because I may or may not like it. So test driving means if it doesn't work out, I'm out. But I want you to think about this. And especially as you have influence over young people who use this phrase, well, you know, you'd never buy a car without test driving it first. I'm committed for life without the test drive means I will make it work no matter what. So when I go buy a car, I'm not buying a car for life. When it no longer works, when I get in the driveway and it cranks up and I go, you know what, this is just not the same thing as it was 15 years ago when I bought it, I might very well go down to the dealership and trade it in. But that's not what my marriage is about. My marriage is about saying I am committed even when it's not working out well, even when it's not going well, even when for whatever reason, it could be sickness, it could be depression, it could be anxiety, it could be just the busyness of life. No matter how it works out or doesn't work out, I am staying in this, I am committed. So the test drive philosophy actually lays the foundation for a later divorce or a later way out, because you say, well, if it doesn't work out, I'm not getting in. That also translates to if it doesn't work out later, then I'm out. So it builds this idea in. That's one of the reasons why couples who live together before marriage have higher divorce rates. Well, some things to remember. First of all, and I'll try to remind us of this every time, we cannot stand in judgment of the culture if we have rejected God's design within our own families and churches. We have to get the plank out of our eye before we look at the speck in our culture's eye. And you may want to say, well, let me tell you, it's the culture who has the plank. I want you to notice in that parable, Jesus never gives you the option of thinking it's the speck that's in your eye. He only gives you the option of thinking that it's the plank that is in your eye. So you should always think, even if it's a speck, you should always think that it is your eye that has the plank. Get the plank out first, and then you can help others get the speck out. Then we must be champions of marriage, family, and children. You might not think of the church that way. You might think of the church as champions of evangelism, champions of discipleship, champions of caring for the needy, but we ought to be champions of all people on earth. The church ought to be pro-family, pro-marriage, pro-kids. We ought to encourage families who have big kids and need help. That's a plug for you guys to come over and watch my kids so me and my wife can go on a date. But and here's the thing, we do have a big family. We have 5 kids, but Lindsay and I almost always recognize, and we have several families in our church that have big families in our church that have a lot of kids, but we almost always recognize, even in churches, there's a little bit of awkwardness around the fact that we have a big family. And so we hear from Christians all the time, oh man, y'all need to get a TV or something. Like, all right, well, we need to be the champions of big families. Why? Because of the next, that last point there. We are never more effective at making disciples than when we raise godly children. The best chance you and I have to make disciples, which is what we are called to do, is to raise godly children. It might not work, and they might reject God, and it's between them and God. But I have no better chance of making a disciple than I do of the 5 children who are in my home. That's the best shot I have of making disciples. And so I have no better chance than raising godly children. Finally, it's the third point in your notes. A culture that does not reproduce is a culture that has signed its own death warrant. A culture that does not reproduce is a culture that has signed its own death warrant. Why is Western culture basically doomed to the ashes and dust of history? Because of our reproduction rates. There's nothing we can do about that, but I want you to understand it's not just Western culture that we ought to be worried about. In fact, it's primarily not Western culture that we ought to be worried about. It's kingdom culture that we ought to be worried about. And it doesn't matter whether it's Western, Eastern, Northern or Southern, or first world, second world, third world. I've even heard people talk about fourth world cultures. What we talk about is kingdom culture. We ought to be fans in the church of reproducing even biological disciple making and reproduction. We ought to be fans of that because we are making disciples and reproducing disciples, and we have a gospel to preach and we have a kingdom to advance, and one of the ways we can do it is by being champions of marriage and family.